The day's last light, a reluctant surrender of the sun, bled through the single large window of Maeve's apartment, painting the pale yellow walls in hues of orange and a tired, smoky gold. It was a moment of grace. She treasured a quiet, almost sacred ritual. The world outside, a ceaseless symphony of horn sirens and human clamor, receded into a manageable murmur, a distant thrumming that was a gentle reminder of its presence, yet a testament to her peaceful insulation from it. Maeve sat at her small round table, a plate of steamed vegetables and a single piece of grilled salmon before her. The meal was simple, healthy, and entirely uninspired, yet it was a comfort in its predictability. The only sounds in the room were the gentle hum of the old refrigerator and the soft, rhythmic clink of her fork against the ceramic plate. She ate slowly, each movement deliberate, a small ritual performed in a silent room. Her apartment was a sanctuary, a space meticulously curated for one. Everything had its place, from the stack of old novels on the bookshelf to the small, thriving monstera plant in the corner. The plant's leaves were a vibrant, unapologetic green, a splash of life in an otherwise muted palette of browns and creams. It was a lone, beautiful thing, much like Maeve herself. She wasn't lonely, not in the way people pitied. She was simply profoundly alone. It was a state she had chosen, a shield she had built brick by brick over the years, a fortress of solitude and routine. She had learned to find peace in this solitude, a quiet dignity that required no external validation. The past was a landscape she had willingly burned, leaving behind only the ashes of memory and the small, quiet life she now inhabited. A faint, almost invisible scar on her left wrist, a thin white line she had long ago learned to ignore, was one of the many reminders of that scorched earth. This silence was a comfort, a blanket woven from the threads of routine and predictability. After dinner, she would wash the dishes by hand, feeling the warm water and the smooth ceramic, another small sensory anchor in her day. Then she would lose herself in a book, the worlds within its pages far more vibrant and less demanding than the one outside. It was a life without risks, without heartaches, and without surprises. And she was content. Or so she told herself. But tonight the silence was broken, if only for a moment. As she took her last bite, a faint, almost inaudible sound came from the street below, the distant, high-pitched laughter of a child. Maeve's fork paused mid-air. An involuntary flinch, a jolt of something akin to pain went through her. Her breath hitched. A fleeting image, sharp and unwanted, flashed in her mind's eye. A boy no older than 5, with wide, terrified eyes, and a bruised cheek, crying silently in the back of a van. The memory was a ghost. She hadn't summoned a wisp of a life she no longer lived. She shook her head slightly, forcing the image away, and finished her meal. It was just an echo, a phantom limb of a past she had amputated long ago. Later, as the last vestiges of twilight gave way to the deep purple of evening, Maeve went out. She was out of milk, a small, justifiable reason to break her evening cocoon. As she walked the few blocks to the corner store, the city's nocturnal life began to awaken. Neon signs hummed, and the smells of street food mingled with the scent of damp pavement. A different kind of sound, a faint, distressed whimpering, caught her attention. It was a sound that cut through the city's ambient noise, a sound of pure vulnerability. She followed it, her feet leading her down a narrow, secluded alleyway where the streetlights didn't reach. There, huddled under a rusted, discarded bench, was a scruffy stray dog no bigger than a shoe. It shivered uncontrollably, its ribs stark against its matted fur, its eyes wide with fear and distrust. It was a creature of the street, forgotten and alone. Most people would have walked past, seeing only a potential source of disease or trouble. But Maeve saw something different. She saw a reflection of a part of herself, scared, alone, and pushed into the shadows. Her empathy, a deep well she rarely allowed herself to drink from, surged to the surface. She knelt slowly, her movements gentle and non-threatening. She spoke in a low, soothing voice, her words meaningless, but her tone filled with a profound empathy that transcended language. "It's okay, little one. It's okay." She reached into her bag and without a second thought pulled out the last piece of her salmon from dinner, a small offering of warmth and care. She placed it on the ground a few feet away from the dog, then sat back on her heels, giving it space. For a long moment the dog stared at her, its head tilted, its body trembling. Its little heart pounded against its ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. It was a standoff between terror and hunger. Slowly, cautiously, it crept forward, its movements hesitant and full of doubt. It sniffed the salmon, then devoured it in a few quick, desperate bites, a tiny, almost imperceptible wag of its tail, the only sign of gratitude. Maeve simply watched, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. It was a small act, a simple kindness that required no courage and asked for no reward. It was a moment of connection in a life defined by disconnection. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she had not allowed herself to feel in years. As she finally left the alley, the dog stayed behind, a little less afraid than before, its belly a little less empty. Maeve continued on her way, the small, tender exchange already fading into the background of her quiet mind. She didn't know it, but this small act of saving a forgotten creature was the last quiet moment before her carefully constructed world would be shattered forever. The past she had so carefully buried was about to knock on her door, and its echo would be deafening. The silence so long her loyal companion was about to be replaced by a cacophony of memories and a confrontation she never wanted. She bought her milk and headed home, the weight of the world feeling a little heavier than usual. She thought of the child. She had remembered the terror in his eyes. It was a memory she had locked away, a dusty old book she refused to open. But the book was no longer dusty. It was on her mind, its pages flipping open in her consciousness. Years ago, she had been a different person. She had been bolder, more engaged with the world. She had believed in justice and had fought for it. She had been a community outreach officer, a job she had loved and lost in a brutal confrontation. That was where the scar on her wrist came from, a souvenir from a night she tried to save a child from a violent man. The rescue had been successful, but the cost had been her career and her belief in the world's goodness. She had retreated, leaving that life and that person behind, brick by painful brick. Now, as she walked home with her milk, the ghost of that past self seemed to be walking beside her. She felt a flicker of the old fire, a spark of the woman who would not stand by and watch a child be hurt. She quickly extinguished it. That wasn't her anymore. She was Maeve, the woman who took care of her plants and her quiet apartment, the woman who ate alone, but the seed of doubt of a half-forgotten duty had been planted. The world was not as simple and contained as she had made it. The echo of silence was about to be broken. Maeve's week passed in the predictable rhythm she had so carefully constructed. The memory of the small dog faded, replaced by the mundane tasks of her life. She worked her job as a data entry specialist, a role that required precision and quiet focus, a perfect fit for a woman who sought to live a life without friction. Her evenings were a steady procession of books, tea, and the gentle, silent company of her houseplants. The fleeting shadow of a child's terror had been pushed back into the recesses of her mind, a door she had firmly shut and locked. But locks, as she was about to discover, were meant to be picked. The knock came on a Friday evening, a firm, deliberate rapping that echoed unnaturally loud in the quiet of her apartment. It wasn't the tentative tap of a delivery person, or the familiar, friendly chime of her elderly neighbor. This was a knock with purpose, a knock that demanded to be heard. Maeve's heart, which had been beating at a steady, peaceful tempo, skipped a beat. She hadn't had a visitor in over a year. She peered through the peephole, her hand hovering over the doorknob. On the other side stood a man in his early 30s. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and a confident, almost professional bearing. He wore a sharp, dark suit that was both elegant and understated. His face was a study in controlled emotion, a serious expression tempered by a strange, profound sadness in his eyes. He didn't look like a salesman or a lost tourist. He looked like he was on a mission. Maeve hesitated, a wave of old anxieties washing over her. She almost didn't open the door. The impulse to retreat, to pull the blinds and pretend she wasn't home, was overwhelming. But then he shifted his weight, and a small, almost imperceptible detail caught her eye. The way his shoulders hunched, the tightness around his jaw, it was the posture of a man carrying an invisible weight. A man who had waited a long time for this moment. Against her better judgment, the door clicked open, secured only by the chain. "Can I help you?" Maeve's voice was low and cautious. The man's gaze met hers. His eyes, a deep, unsettling shade of brown, searched her face as if looking for a ghost. "Maeve Allister." He asked, his voice a rich baritone, surprisingly gentle. "It's Maeve." She corrected him, leaving her last name unsaid. She had long ago dropped her married name, another brick in her wall of solitude. "Maeve." He corrected himself instantly, a flash of recognition in his eyes. "My name is Elias Vance." He paused, taking a breath as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. I believe we met a long time ago. Maeve's brow furrowed. She searched her memory, but there was nothing. This man was a stranger, an elegant enigma on her doorstep. I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else, she said, her voice firm, pushing the door to close. Elias held up a hand, his movement slow and deliberate, a plea to wait. Please, just for a moment. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a worn, slightly creased photograph. With a respectful gesture, he slid it through the small gap of the chained door. Maeve picked up the picture. It was an old photograph, the colors faded and soft. In it was a small boy, no older than 5, with a mass of unruly dark hair and a pair of eyes that were wide with terror. His cheek was bruised, a dark smudge of purple against his pale skin. He was clutching a small stuffed bear, and his thin, fragile body seemed to be recoiling from something just out of frame. The boy's eyes, full of unspeakable fear, were the same eyes she had seen in her nightmare, the same echo of a memory she had fought to bury. A cold certainty settled in the pit of her stomach. She felt the blood drain from her face. She looked up at Elias, her own eyes wide with a dawning horror. Do you remember him? Elias asked, his voice now thick with emotion. Maeve said nothing. She simply stared at the boy in the photo, a ghost from a life she had carefully erased. Her hand trembled, and she felt the familiar phantom ache in her wrist, a reminder of the night she had saved this child. It was a memory she had locked away, a dusty old book she refused to open. But the book was no longer dusty. It was in her hand, its pages flipping open in her consciousness. I don't know what you're talking about. She lied, her voice a brittle whisper. She pushed the photograph back through the gap, her hands shaking. Elias didn't take the photo. It fell to the floor, face up, the small boy's terrified eyes staring up at them. Elias's own eyes, full of a strange mixture of gratitude and pain, were fixed on her. You saved me, he said simply. You saved me from him. You brought me to the hospital and you stayed with me until the police came. You told them everything and you testified. You gave me my life back. Maeve's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and disbelief. This was impossible. This was her past, a different person's past. She was a quiet, solitary woman now. This man, this story, was an invasion. It was a direct assault on the carefully constructed peace she had built for herself. That was a long time ago. She said, her voice strained. She wanted him to go away. She wanted to close the door and pretend this had never happened. The memory of her old self, the woman who fought for justice and took on the world, was a painful one. It was a person she had lost, a person she didn't know how to be anymore. Yes, it was, Elias agreed, his voice softening. But he's back. Maeve froze. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant city noises all faded. The world shrank to this one man, this one devastating sentence. What? She whispered. The man who abused me. My father. Elias's voice was cold, flat. He's out of prison. He's powerful now. He never forgot what you did. He's been watching you. I've seen him, Maeve. He's a different man on the outside, but inside, he's still the same monster. This was the breaking point. This was the moment of no return. The peaceful, quiet life Maeve had so carefully cultivated was not a fortress. It was a glass house, and Elias's words were the stone that shattered it. The past wasn't a ghost. It was a hungry predator, and it had been stalking her all along. The man she had put behind bars, the man who had cost her her career and her sense of safety, was now a threat not just to her peaceful solitude, but to her very existence. Elias reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a crisp business card. I'm a lawyer now, he said, his voice firm with purpose. I've been building my career for this. I've been waiting for him. But he's bigger than I am, and he has more influence. I need your help, Maeve. The world thinks you're just a solitary woman, but I know what you are. I know what you can do. You're a fighter. I need the woman who saved a scared little boy to come back and help me finish this. He slid the card through the gap, letting it fall onto the floor beside the old photograph. The card was a testament to his success, to the future she had given him. The photograph was a testament to the past she had tried to bury. They lay side by side, two pieces of a story she had hoped was over. Maeve stared at the card, the name Elias Vance, and the prestigious law firm printed in elegant lettering. She then looked down at the photograph of the terrified boy, a ghost of a child she had once saved. The conflict was a physical ache in her chest. The desire to retreat to slam the door and pretend this conversation never happened, warred with a long dormant instinct, a buried fire that was now being fanned by the wind of this man's words. She was torn between the woman she had become and the woman she had once been. She looked up at Elias, his face a mix of desperate hope and a deep, unshakable certainty. He knew she had it in her. He was counting on her. And in that moment, Maeve knew her quiet, solitary life was over. The door was no longer a shield. It was a barrier, a flimsy, pathetic defense against a past she could no longer outrun. She picked up the business card and the photograph, her hands no longer shaking but steady with a dawning resolve. The battle for her soul, and for the soul of the child she had saved, had just begun. There was no going back now. The old photograph and the new business card lay on Maeve's kitchen table, two disparate artifacts of her life, one representing a painful past and the other a terrifying present. She sat in the silent apartment long after Elias had gone, the quiet hum of the refrigerator no longer a comfort, but a mockery of her shattered peace. The man had promised to call in the morning. He had left her with a choice, but she knew it wasn't a choice at all. The past had reemerged, and with it, the truth of who she was had been unceremoniously dropped at her feet. She was not just Maeve, the solitary woman with the quiet life. She was Maeve, the fighter, the savior, and now the hunted. The morning light, when it finally arrived, was gray and dismal, a fitting backdrop for the storm brewing inside her. She replayed the conversation with Elias 100 times. His words a constant chilling refrain. "He's been watching you." The thought was a violation, an unseen hand reaching into her sanctuary. She felt a cold anger rise within her, a dormant fire she hadn't felt in a decade. Just as she was about to call Elias, a frantic knock sounded on her door, a desperate rapid-fire pounding that was nothing like the measured knock of the night before. Maeve's heart leapt into her throat. She didn't bother with the peephole. She knew. She unlatched the chain and swung the door open, her body tensing, ready for a fight. It was Elias, but a different Elias. His normally composed facade was gone, replaced by a look of wild, desperate urgency. His expensive suit was rumpled, and a bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. "We have to go," he said, his voice low and strained, glancing over his shoulder. "They know I was here. I was followed." Maeve didn't question him. The cold anger from earlier solidified into a focused resolve. The fight she had been preparing for was here now. She grabbed her keys and her small purse, leaving everything else behind. As they hurried down the fire escape, Elias explained, "I had a feeling something was wrong. My car was bugged. I'm a lawyer, Maeve. I know what they're capable of. I led them on a wild goose chase, but they're not stupid. They'll find me, and they'll find you." They ducked into a crowded side street, blending in with the morning commuters. Elias, though a successful lawyer, was a man of logic and procedure, not of street smarts. He was out of his element, and his fear was palpable. Maeve, however, was in hers. The years of quiet had not erased her instincts. Her eyes scanned the crowd, her mind cataloging faces, movements, and potential threats. She saw a flicker of movement in an alleyway ahead. A man with a distinctive build and a grim expression. He was looking directly at them. "Down here," Maeve said, her voice sharp and commanding. She grabbed Elias's arm, pulling him into a narrow, winding alley. It was a familiar landscape for her, the underbelly of the city where she had once worked. She had memorized its passages, its secret routes, and its hiding spots. Elias followed his confusion, turning to a grudging admiration as she navigated the maze of garbage cans and graffiti-covered walls with practiced ease. They reached a dead end, a concrete wall looming impossibly high. Elias's breath hitched. "There's nowhere to go," he whispered, his shoulders slumping. "I know," Maeve said calmly. She could hear the heavy footsteps approaching from behind them, and then the man from the alley appeared. He was a brute, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a sneer that twisted his face. He held a pipe in his hand, a crude, menacing weapon. He was the same man who had followed Elias, a goon hired to intimidate and, if necessary, to silence them. "Alistair wants a word." The man growled, his eyes fixed on Maeve. He recognized her. He was one of the men she had fought off all those years ago, a piece of her past brought back to life in the most brutal way. The irony was not lost on her. This was the initial confrontation, the moment of truth. Elias stepped in front of Maeve, his hands raised in a defensive posture, a futile, noble gesture. "We're not going anywhere with you," he said, his voice trembling but firm. The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He lunged at Elias, a blur of motion and malice. But Maeve was faster. Years of routine and quiet living had hidden her physical prowess, but it hadn't erased it. The training she had received as an outreach officer, the martial arts she had practiced, was still etched into her muscle memory. She moved with a fluid, precise grace that was shocking in its effectiveness. She didn't punch or kick wildly. She used her opponent's momentum against him, a series of quick, calculated movements that disarmed and incapacitated him. She twisted his arm, forcing him to drop the pipe, and then used a simple but painful hold to bring him to his knees. The whole sequence took less than 5 seconds. Elias watched, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and awe. This was not the woman who had sat quietly in her apartment. This was a force of nature, a controlled storm of skill and power. He saw her for what she truly was, not just a kind woman, but a warrior who had intentionally buried her strength. He was her Ngoi Trogyup, the one person who would now bear witness to her secret, her dormant power. He had come to her for help, and in this moment he realized she was more than capable of providing it. The man on the ground, defeated and humiliated, glared up at Maeve. He spit on the ground. "You'll pay for this, bitch," he snarled. "Alistair's not going to be happy. This ain't over." With a final effort, he scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the city's labyrinth. Maeve's face was unreadable, her breathing steady. She looked at Elias, her eyes a dark, bottomless pool of old pain and new resolve. "He's gone," she said, her voice flat. She released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Who is Alistair?" Elias asked, his voice still shaky. He had a million questions, but that was the only one that mattered. "Alistair is the man who owns your father," Maeve said, her voice filled with a chilling certainty. "He's the one who was pulling the strings 10 years ago, the man who got your father out of prison on a technicality. He's a powerful, influential man, the kind of man who thinks he's untouchable, the man who just hired a goon to break my kneecaps. He's the real threat." Meanwhile, miles away, Alistair, a man of quiet power and ruthless ambition, sat in his pristine office overlooking the city. A phone call informed him of the failed attempt. He listened, his face impassive, and then he slowly put the phone down. He did not yell or curse. His anger was a cold, silent thing. The goon's description of Maeve's skill, her precise, almost professional movements, resonated with a deeper fear. This was not a simple, soft woman. She was a professional, a dangerous loose end. She knew too much, and she was capable of too much. He didn't see her as a threat to be intimidated. He saw her as a problem to be permanently eliminated. His cold, calculated anger showed that he was a far more dangerous adversary than the brute in the alley. The game was no longer about an old grudge. It was about survival. The next few days were a blur of intense preparation. Maeve and Elias were now in hiding, moving between safe houses that Elias, with his lawyer's foresight and resources, had secured. Their dynamic had shifted dramatically. Elias, the confident and poised lawyer, was now Maeve's student, and Maeve, the quiet recluse, was now his teacher. She was a different person in this mode. Her movements economical, her mind a steel trap of strategy and foresight. She taught him the basics of self-defense, how to spot a tail, and how to communicate in a way that couldn't be intercepted. He in turn used his legal expertise to explain Alistair's corporate structure and his influence, a web of power so vast it seemed impenetrable. They were two halves of a whole, a strategist and a tactician, an unlikely partnership forged in the crucible of a shared enemy. Maeve learned that Alistair had built his empire on a foundation of legal loopholes and veiled threats. He was a man who never got his hands dirty, always operating through proxies. Elias's father was just one of many small-time criminals he had used and then cast aside. But Elias's father was also a loose end, a witness who could tie Alistair to a decade-old crime. Alistair was now trying to tie up all loose ends, and Maeve and Elias were at the top of his list. Their one advantage was Alistair's ego. He was a man who loved the public spotlight, who reveled in his image as a philanthropist and a community pillar. He was hosting a massive charity gala, a black tie auction for a children's foundation, an event dripping with irony that was his pet project. It was to be held at his sprawling, opulent estate, a fortress of security and wealth. This was their arena, the symbolic ground where they would face him. It's too dangerous, Maeve, Elias argued, pacing the floor of their latest hideout. We're going into his territory. He'll have his best men there. This isn't a back alley, this is his home court. Exactly. Maeve said, her voice calm and steady, as she sharpened a small, innocuous-looking metal file. We have to go where he feels untouchable. That's where he'll be careless. He'll be surrounded by people, but he'll be isolated. He'll be a god on his throne. Gods are easy to knock off. Their plan was audacious and hinged on a single critical piece of evidence. Elias had uncovered a series of shell companies and offshore accounts that funneled money to his father and other criminals, all tied back to Alistair. The key was a physical ledger, a handwritten record of these transactions that Alistair kept in his private office, a place he believed no one could ever reach. The night of the gala arrived a whirlwind of luxury cars, flashing cameras, and high society. Maeve, wearing a simple yet elegant black gown, and Elias looking impossibly handsome in his tuxedo, entered the estate as a couple. They were two faces in a sea of hundreds, and for the first time in years, Maeve felt the weight of being seen. It was a terrifying and exhilarating sensation. The place was a monument to excess marble floors, soaring ceilings, priceless art, and a small army of security guards all disguised as caterers and staff. As they made their way through the crowd, Alistair himself, a man with a charming smile and eyes as cold as a winter night, spotted them. He walked over, a glass of champagne in his hand, a fake smile plastered on his face. "Elias Vance, a pleasure to see you," he said, his voice smooth as silk, a hint of steel just beneath the surface. He turned to Maeve. "And who is this lovely lady?" "This is Maeve," Elias said, his hand resting protectively on her lower back. "A colleague." Alistair's smile tightened. He saw the subtle hint of old power in Maeve's eyes, the strength she tried to conceal. He knew instinctively that this was the woman who had bested his man in the alley. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I hope your colleague understands that some professional matters are best handled privately." He gave her a chilling, knowing look before moving on. He had just issued his threat in plain sight, a silent challenge in a room full of people. The tension was palpable, a live wire running through their carefully constructed facade. The clock was ticking. Elias had a limited window of time to create a diversion that would draw Alistair and his inner circle away from the office wing. Meanwhile, Maeve had to navigate the estate's complex security, a task made all the more difficult by the sheer number of people present. The gauntlet had begun. She watched as Elias started a heated but quiet conversation with one of Alistair's key business partners, a man notorious for a short fuse. The diversion was subtle but effective. A few moments later, Alistair and his men moved to a more secluded part of the garden to deal with the dispute. Maeve, now alone, slipped away from the main hall, moving with the practiced stealth of a ghost. The world for her was no longer a place of sound and sight, but a matrix of angles, shadows, and vulnerabilities. She moved past security guards who looked but did not see her. She was a silent echo in the fortress of a powerful man. The office was located in a secluded wing of the estate. The door was reinforced steel, and the lock was a biometric scanner. Maeve, using a modified tool she had spent days fabricating, bypassed the scanner with the precision of a surgeon. She was no longer Maeve, the quiet recluse. She was the ghost of a trained operative, the part of her she had locked away for years. She entered the room, and the door sealed behind her with a heavy click. And then she saw Elias. He was tied to a chair, a gag in his mouth, a bruise on his cheek. Alistair's personal bodyguard, a mountain of a man with a cold, dead stare, stood over him. The goon from the alley was there too, his face a mask of triumphant malice. Elias had been captured, and she had walked right into a trap. The gauntlet was not just a test of her skills. It was a desperate race against time to save the very person who had brought her back from the dead. The world shrank to the dimensions of Alistair's private office, a gilded cage where the cold, cruel truth lay bare. Maeve stood in the doorway, the sound of the door clicking shut behind her, a final definitive period on her peaceful life. Elias, her hopeful protégé and the living symbol of her past act of kindness, was tied to a mahogany chair, a helpless captive. The mountain of a man who served as Alistair's personal bodyguard, a figure of silent, brutal efficiency, stood over him. The goon from the alley, a man whose face was now a mask of triumphant malice, watched from a corner, a smug grin on his lips. Alistair was not present, a fact that both frustrated and terrified Maeve. This was not a fair fight, but a trap laid by a coward. The goon, however, was eager to prove himself. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in," he sneered, sauntering forward, his eyes full of vindictive glee. "We knew you'd come for him. You just couldn't resist playing the hero, could you?" Maeve's gaze was unblinking. The fear she had once felt was gone, replaced by a cold surgical focus. She had walked into this arena alone, and she would have to get them both out alone. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of strategy and memory, began to work. She was no longer just a woman fighting for her life. She was a master of her craft, a ghost of a trained operative. The room with its priceless antiques and heavy furniture became a landscape of opportunities and threats. The bodyguard, a far more dangerous adversary than the goon, took a step forward, his massive frame blocking the only exit. His eyes were cold and dead, devoid of emotion. He was a professional. Maeve knew she couldn't overpower him. She had to outsmart him. "You're wrong," Maeve said, her voice surprisingly calm and clear. She was not speaking to the goon. She was speaking to Elias. "I didn't come for him." The goon froze, confused. Elias, his eyes wide with fear and despair, looked at her, a silent plea for an explanation. "I came for this," Maeve said, her eyes flicking to the far end of the office, to a small hidden safe behind a bookshelf. It was a bluff, a calculated risk based on the assumption that Alistair was an arrogant man who kept his most prized possession, the ledger, close by. The goon and the bodyguard, both loyal to Alistair's interests, followed her gaze. They looked at the safe, a moment of confusion and uncertainty passing between them. That was all Maeve needed. In a breathtakingly swift and choreographed motion, she moved. Her hand shot out, not at the goon, but at a heavy, ornate lamp on a nearby table. She yanked the cord, sending the lamp crashing to the floor. The loud smash echoing in the dead silence of the room was the perfect diversion. The goon flinched. The bodyguard, momentarily distracted, turned his head. And that was Maeve's chance. She moved with a speed that defied her age, a fluid blur of motion that had long been dormant. She didn't fight them head-on. Instead, she used the environment. She grabbed a small, heavy statue from a side table, and with a precise motion, hurled it at a full-length mirror, shattering it into 1,000 reflective shards. The loud, chaotic sound and the sudden visual distraction were overwhelming. The bodyguard, a man of brute force, was disoriented by the chaos. The goon, his eyes momentarily on the shattered mirror, was caught off guard. Maeve, in the same breath, used her momentum to leap onto the desk, kicking a heavy bookstand at the bodyguard's knees. He stumbled, a mountain, momentarily thrown off balance. Then came the breathless moment. The goon, recovering, charged at her, his face a mask of rage. He reached for her, and in that split second, everything seemed to fail. His hand closed around her wrist, the same wrist with the small scar. He squeezed hard, his face a centimeter from hers. This was it. The past, the old trauma, had returned to claim her. But Maeve was no longer the woman who ran. She met his gaze, her eyes hard and cold. She didn't struggle against his grip. Instead, she used a move so subtle, so precise, it was almost invisible. She twisted her wrist, a tiny, almost imperceptible rotation that caught him off guard, and then with a final explosive burst of energy, she pulled him forward, sending him crashing into the bodyguard, who was just regaining his footing. The two men collided in a heap of tangled limbs and curses. Maeve didn't wait. She grabbed a heavy file from Alistair's desk and slammed it down onto the desk, hitting a hidden button that she had seen Elias's father use in the old investigation files. A small concealed panel in the wall slid open, revealing a live video feed of the gala. The feed, which was broadcasting Alistair's speech to the guests in the other rooms of the estate, suddenly cut to the office. Alistair, in the middle of a self-congratulatory speech on stage, saw his face replaced by the image of his two men, now defeated and scrambling on the floor, and a woman standing over them, her face a picture of grim triumph. The camera focused on the open safe, revealing the leather-bound ledger. Maeve had not only defeated his men, but had also exposed his most damning secret to the entire world. The reactions of the witnesses were immediate and profound. The crowd at the gala, from powerful politicians to influential socialites, fell into a stunned silence. They saw the chaos, the defeated men, and the ledger. Their faces projected on the large screens of the gala shifted from confusion to shock. then to dawning horror as they realized the full extent of Alistair's hypocrisy. The silence was deafening, the collective breath of hundreds of people held in unison. And then the gasps began, a wave of whispers and murmurs that quickly grew into a roar of outrage. Maeve on the video feed looked directly into the camera, a symbol of justice that had emerged from the shadows. The vindication was not just for her and Elias, but for everyone Alistair had ever wronged. It was the moment of her triumphant return, a silent hero finally recognized. Maeve, her heart still pounding, didn't bask in the moment. She quickly untied Elias, who was now staring at her with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. He had witnessed it all, her forgotten strength, her brilliant strategy, and her ultimate victory. He wasn't just grateful anymore. He was in awe of the woman who had not just saved him once but twice. The world too now saw her for what she was, a quiet force of nature, a legend returned. The aftermath was a swift and decisive maelstrom. Alistair's opulent estate, once a bastion of untouchable power, became a crime scene. Police swarmed the grounds, cameras flashed, and the news vans that had arrived to cover the gala now reported on a scandal that would rock the city's political and financial elite. Alistair himself, his face a mask of shattered hubris and cold fury, was arrested on the spot. The digital and physical evidence found in his office, thanks to Maeve's quick thinking, and the broadcast, was overwhelming. The reign of the man who hid behind layers of wealth and influence was brought down by a quiet woman he had mistakenly dismissed as a ghost. His ultimate downfall was perfectly aligned with his crimes. His public image of a philanthropist, now irrevocably tainted by his true nature, exposed for the entire world to see. The lesser villains also met their fate. The goon from the alley and the silent bodyguard were apprehended. Elias's father, the original abuser who had served as Alistair's pawn, was also brought back into custody, his parole revoked. The justice Maeve had fought for years ago was now finally complete. Among the crowd, a different kind of justice was served. A prominent city councilman who had publicly looked down on Maeve at the start of the evening, and who had often dismissed Elias's legal efforts as a young man's folly, was caught on camera with a look of pure, unadulterated shame. The councilman, let's call him Mr. Henderson, was a man of immense pride and prejudice. He had seen Maeve as a lowly, solitary woman, and Elias as a boy without connections. Now he saw the truth. He saw a hero and a brilliant lawyer who had toppled a giant. A few days later, he made a public statement of apology to both Maeve and Elias, a humble act that showed he had in fact learned his lesson. He had been a Ngoy Hu Lam, and his public repentance was a testament to the power of Maeve's actions. The next morning, as the city reeled from the fallout, Maeve was back in her quiet apartment. But this time it felt different. The silence was not the same. It was no longer a shield, but a vessel waiting to be filled. Elias came to see her, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked tired, but triumphant. "I can't thank you enough, Maeve," he said, sitting at her small kitchen table. The old photograph and the business card were no longer on the table. They were now framed, hanging side by side on her wall, a testament to their shared history. "You saved me twice, once as a boy and again as a man." Maeve smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "You saved me too, Elias. You pulled me out of the silence. I was living a half-life. I was a ghost. You gave me a reason to come back." He understood. He saw the fire in her eyes that had been dormant for so long, the strength she had so painstakingly hidden. The quiet, solitary woman was gone. In her place was a woman who was whole again. The victory, however, was not just personal. The foundation Alistair had used as a front was taken over by a new board of directors led by Elias. He renamed it the Maeve Foundation, a charity dedicated to providing legal and emotional support to children from abusive homes. Elias offered Maeve a high-level position as the head of security and outreach, not just for her skills, but for her profound integrity and empathy. Maeve initially hesitated. The idea of re-entering the world she had left behind was daunting. But she looked at the framed photograph on her wall, the terrified boy with the bruised cheek. She thought of the little dog she had saved, the one now sleeping peacefully on her couch, a new companion. This was not a job offer. It was a calling. It was a chance to use her past, her pain, and her extraordinary talents to help others who had been in the same position as Elias all those years ago. It was a chance to rewrite her own story, not as a victim who had retreated, but as a hero who had returned. The final piece of her new life was the most unexpected. Elias revealed a final act of kindness. He had purchased the building she lived in and had gifted it to her an act of gratitude that was both a symbol of his thanks and a quiet promise of a secure future. It was a gesture that cemented their bond, a new family forged, not by blood, but by courage and kindness. Maeve, in a life that had once been defined by solitude, now had a home, a purpose, and a family. The quiet had returned, but this time it was a peaceful, contented hum of a life truly lived. 2 years later, the scent of fresh brewed coffee mingled with the earthy aroma of damp soil, a pleasant and familiar fragrance that filled the air of Maeve's now bustling apartment. The quiet, solitary existence of her past was a distant memory. The apartment, once a sanctuary of silence, was now a vibrant hub of life and purpose. Sunlight streamed through the large window, illuminating the thriving monstera plant, and a new addition, a small flowering jasmine bush that filled the air with its sweet perfume. The tiny stray dog she had saved, no longer scruffy and timid, was now a well-fed, happy companion named Hope, who slept curled up at her feet. Maeve herself had changed not in essence, but in outward expression. The lines of tension had softened from her face, replaced by a quiet confidence and a warmth that radiated from within. She was now the head of security and community outreach for the Maeve Foundation, a role she embraced with a passion she thought she had lost forever. The foundation, under her and Elias's joint leadership, had grown exponentially, providing legal aid counseling and a safe harbor for hundreds of children and families. She was no longer just a woman who had saved one child. She was a woman who was changing the lives of many. Her day was a joyful blur of meetings, mentoring, and making a real difference. She spent her mornings at the Foundation's headquarters, a bustling office filled with the energy of dedicated lawyers and social workers. She spent her afternoons mentoring young women who wanted to enter the field of security and law, teaching them not just her physical skills, but also the value of empathy and the power of a quiet, watchful presence. She was living a life that was both rich in purpose and deeply fulfilling. One warm afternoon, she and Elias were having coffee at a small outdoor cafe, the very spot where she had first spotted the councilman, who had since become one of the Foundation's most vocal supporters. Elias, now a senior partner at his firm and a respected voice in the community, looked at her with a mix of gratitude and immense pride. "Remember when I knocked on your door, Maeve?" he asked, a gentle smile on his face. "I came to repay a kindness, and you ended up giving me a new life." Maeve laughed softly, a sound that was both full of joy and a quiet acknowledgement of the long road they had traveled. "You gave me a new one too, Elias. I was living in the past. You gave me a future." It was the truth. The kindness she had shown him as a child had rippled through time, a stone dropped into a pond, creating waves that had not only saved him, but had also returned to her, lifting her from a sea of quiet desperation. The story ends with a beautiful symbolic image. Maeve is at the Foundation's new community center, a place filled with the laughter of children and the hope of new beginnings. She is teaching a small group of young women, future protectors and advocates, a simple self-defense technique. Her movements are graceful and powerful, a testament to her past. But her words are a testament to her future. Strength isn't about how hard you can hit, she tells them, her voice calm and firm. It's about knowing when to be quiet, when to be patient, and when to act. It's about being a silent protector, a light in the shadows, for those who can't protect themselves. She looks out the window at the setting sun, casting a golden glow over the playground where children are laughing and playing safe and sound. The small, almost forgotten scar on her wrist is a faint, almost invisible reminder of a past trauma. It is no longer a symbol of retreat, but a badge of honor, a mark of the battles she fought and won. It is a symbol of a life that was broken, but was then rebuilt, a life that was once in the shadows, but now shines brightly, a testament to the fact that kindness, no matter how small, always finds its way back home. If this story stirred your heart, if it reminds you that courage can alter destinies, and that light always finds a path, even in the deepest darkness, please leave a comment. Share this story with those who need inspiration. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss our upcoming stories.